Evolution. Evolution is one of the strongest theories that we have in science. It's backed up by an enormous amount of evidence. But understanding evolution takes a little bit of work. Now, a big misconception with evolution is that people think misconception means something that people believe that is completely and utterly wrong. People think that animals and organisms just change or adapt because they need to, because there's a need in life or whatever. Now I can see how the misconception is created. So you think, oh, I just need to be able to survive, and all the water that I have around me is salty. And so if I just drink a little bit of salty water, eventually my body will adapt and it will change because it needs to survive. This is completely wrong. So what happens is every organism has variation throughout the species. We have genetic diversity. Some organisms are better at certain situations than others. And it doesn't have to do with the fact that I need to survive, so therefore I will. If I don't have what it takes to survive, I die. That's how it works. And then my genes, which aren't as effective in this new environment or the change, are kind of taken out of the gene pool. And the organisms that are left are the organisms that are now better at surviving in that environment, and they're the ones that are left to make more organisms. So their genes will be more frequent in the gene pool. Now, this doesn't change or alter a species until these genes become the dominant genes in the species. So we don't really see change in a species or speciation until longer periods of time, where this might make a big enough difference to change the whole species, make it a completely different species than another species. But this is the thing we need to grasp our head around, that it's not that things change because they need to, it's that populations, species change over time. Individuals don't. Individuals die, or individuals make more babies and then they die off and their babies become more successful because then their babies also have variation in the gene. But we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail with some examples in a minute. So evolution, main thing you need to know about evolution is all life comes from other life. All species evolved from an earlier ancestral species. So we have this cladogram. You guys probably have seen these in 7th grade, where it has the ancestral species, and then some kind of environmental change happened where these branched off to a different subset of species, and this branched off to a different subset of species, and both of these changed from the ancestral bear species. We call that speciation. So it's when species are diverting and becoming different species. Now, for something to be a different species, we technically have this slight definition where it says they're not going to interbreed in the wild. They don't normally come into contact with the other and can breed. Now, most of the time we like to say that means because the genes don't align, the DNA doesn't match up, and then it can't produce a viable offspring, something that will make more babies. But sometimes we find in nature that perfect boxes we like to place things in aren't always perfect, and some of these species can interbreed, but most of them can't. Closely related species can interbreed, and I'll talk about that in about 10 seconds here. All right, so here we have this ancestral bear, and then it branched off, and this is where the giant panda comes from. And then this branches off where all of these different bears now are existing from this one ancestral branch here. Now, the speckled bear, or sorry, I can't say that right. It's the spectacle bear. There we go. The glasses, that's what that word means. Like, see, it's where, look, it's wearing glasses here. And the sloth bear, these are organisms that live in South America. I have no idea where the sun bear lives. American black bear, the Asiatic black bear. So these are bears that both live in sort of northern-ish climates. This one in America, this one in Asia. And then polar bear, the entire pole. So throughout top of North America, Russia, that an area. And then we have the brown bear, lives in similar environments. Now, these two are close enough. We call them different species, but we are seeing that they are creating hybrid species currently. And so we actually have a mix between a polar bear and brown bear, or sometimes these are called Kodiak bear, up in the north, which is kind of cool. So we can see some evidence for evolution in structure of organisms. We can see past organisms, we can see how they look very similar, they have similar bone structure, and when we look at the DNA, we can actually trace back all those similarities and see sort of back in time where these organisms split in their ancestral tree. We can also see evidence of evolution through something called embryology. So here is a little bit of a diagram, but I'm going to click on this here. We see the development of a quail. This is a type of bird, close to a chicken. We have quails here, so you should know what a quail is. But here we go. We have the start of this development of this organism after it's gone through many different cycles where it started an egg and now it's developed into many cells, and then cells actually started to differentiate. So you've got this organism here. We see right here, it's kind of hard to see on your screen. Let's see if I can zoom in here. But we actually have gill slits in these organisms. Now these are photographs, so they're not drawings, but we have gill slits, and we see these gill slits not only in birds, but we see them in mammals, we see them in fish on this early stage. This body shape, this form, and these gill slits, and how these organisms are developing in their different stages kind of show a common ancestor where we still have these. Now, if you know anything about birds, you know they don't have gills. They don't breathe in the water. But it kind of points back to an ancestral fish really, really far back in our ancestral patterns. Now, if we go to humans, this is a human baby. I know it's super gross, but it's kind of cute here. But it's anywhere before that, it's pretty gross. So we've got this baby here. This is an umbilical cord, in case those of you who are thinking something else. But this is an umbilical cord going to the mother. And if we go back in time, we go back to these structures where this baby is developing in the womb, and we see very similar structures to that bird that we just saw. We have gill slits here, so humans start off with gill slits. So we look at embryology and we look at all the different organisms and we compare them with one another. What we find is extremely common similarities between species that aren't even in the same categories. I mean, it would make sense for mammals like this pig and this human to be very, very similar as they develop into a more developed fetus and then into an organism. But here we see birds and snakes have very similar starting points as well. Other evidence for evolution is in different organisms. We'll talk about that in a minute. But natural selection. So natural selection is a type of evolution. We have different types of evolution. Natural selection specifically is the environment, you can think of it as selecting for specific traits. It was proposed by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. I know you've only heard of Darwin, you haven't heard of Wallace at all, but they actually proposed this at the same time, not really together, but in separate papers. They came up with this idea that when an environment changes, when mountain ranges rise and separate populations, or a river comes through, or large natural disasters change the environment, or climate change comes around, these changes in the environment put stress and pressure on different organisms. And these environmental pressures change organisms, not because the organism needs to change, but because the pressures put on the organisms stress certain members of the population to the point of not existing anymore. They die out. And, oh, hold on. I clicked on something. I didn't mean to. Sorry. Anyway, an example of that would be this peppered moth here that we have here. There's variation in the species. Some peppered moth have a lot of dark markings. Some of them have a lot of light markings. As you can see here in this variation of this peppered moth here. This is a very famous one. You probably already talked about it in some of your classes, maybe in 7th grade as well. The idea here is that individual organisms must struggle constantly to survive by getting enough food, water, and other resources to avoid being eaten by predators, to survive, and also to be successful enough to reproduce. Individuals in a population with specific advantages over other individuals are more likely to survive and more likely to produce offspring that have that same specific example. Now, the peppered moth is a good example of this. Humans kind of messed with the evolution of the peppered moth and creating varieties that are actually almost completely black, like this one here. So what happened is the Industrial Revolution came around. We were burning a ton of forests, and then we decided we couldn't get enough energy out of the forest, so we dug up this rock called coal, which had an immense amount of energy compared to the wood that we were burning. And we were producing more and more. That's why it's the Industrial Revolution. Industry was really, really high, but environmental protections, not so much. So all of this excess stuff we were burning that didn't quite properly burn, all this soot in the air, got into the air so much that clouds of this just soot and smoke darkened the skies so much that in some cities the lights had to be turned on during the day so that people could see and move about just in normal life in the city. Well, a lot of the forests in the UK were covered in soot, so a lot of the trees just had black bark due to this. So what happened was, if we were looking at the bark of the tree here, a normal bird would come by and see this moth here, but it wouldn't see the variety with a lot more speckles that maybe you haven't noticed right here. So in normal natural selection, birds will come by and they'll eat all these black ones because they're easy to see, they're easy to spot. This one's much more camouflage, you don't see it, and so we get more of these genes in the population than we have these black varieties. However, in the UK, we started seeing a lot fewer of these kind of speckled variety because the trees were covered in soot. So here's an example of a darker bark here where the black one is now more camouflaged than this white one. So this white one, the white one started getting picked off by birds. They weren't adapting because they needed to. They were dying and getting eaten by the predator coming by because they were easily spotted. And then what we had was darker varieties left to breed and make more organisms. So we highly changed the coloration of these organisms to be much more dark and to have much more variety of these dark individuals just because we changed the color of the trees. Now, depending on the forest these organisms are in, you'll see a larger variety of the dark versions, or you'll see a larger variety of the light varieties, depending on where you're at and depending on the darkness of the trees, just because local environmental factors select for specific varieties. So here's our idea here. Traits make organisms more successful. If you are more successful in your environment, you live longer and you have time to make more babies. So natural selection favors individuals that possess heritable traits that give them some advantage over other individuals in a given population. And what we call these things is adaptations. So the idea here is you're more successful, you make more babies. Pause the video if you need to write some notes on that. I'm going to go ahead and keep going. Alright, so if you have more babies, that means more of your genes are going to be entering the population. Now, over long periods of time, this can alter the population to make your genes be more prevalent to the population. Now, this takes many, many generations because let's say my genes are really, really successful and I had all these babies. Well, if I have a population of, let's see, even like a small population of 1,000 individuals, these 6 individuals aren't that many people in the population. But if these 6 individuals have successful genes and they have more babies, then maybe these 6 turn into 30. And then the next generation, those 30 may turn into 50. So it takes multiple generations for these genes to alter the whole species, because it takes that long for successive pregnancies and having that many babies changing the population till you have some more individuals having these same genes. So a good example of this is humans. So starting with this, gene variation or changes in your gene happens through mutation. Mutation is a normal process. It can happen through radiation. It can just happen in mistakes that your DNA makes when it's replicating code. Most mutations are neutral. So I need to keep that in mind. Most mutations are neutral. They aren't good, they aren't bad. A lot of mutations, well, that's outside of those neutrals, are negative, and then some mutations actually benefit you. Now, it could be that you can have some mutation that's not useful for you, or it's not really helpful for you. Maybe it's negative in whatever environment you have. And then maybe you get transported to a different environment, or your environment changes, and all of a sudden that mutation is now useful. So here's an example of human mutation. Humans, if you didn't know, we've been able to show through DNA testing that humans all come from Africa. So we all have African heritage somewhere in our DNA patterns. And we can see this specifically through our mitochondrial DNA. But let's go ahead and talk about this skin color. So this is a map of indigenous people. Indigenous people doesn't mean like where I was born and then therefore I'm indigenous to that region. It means where these genes developed on planet Earth. And what's interesting is you can look at a map. This is a map of skin color for indigenous people. So where people developed in the world. So yeah, we got a lot of white people here. We didn't develop here in Utah. Our genes, white people genes, came from more Northern Europe area here. So if we look at this map of indigenous people, people that developed for a long period of time before we had transport and we were able to actually fly around the planet and then be wherever, is right here along this line where this darkest skin color resides. This is the equator. And notice how the further you get away from the equator, for the most part, the lighter the skin color becomes for indigenous people. So here we have some really dark people in Australia, but the further they go south, the lighter the skin color becomes. And the same thing is here. As you come out of Africa and you move up through the Middle East, the Mediterranean, the higher you get up on the planet, as we get to these northern countries, the lighter the skin color becomes. We've got Russia up here. We've got some Asians high up here in China and in Korea. The further you go down, and it's true for India as well, the deeper you go into India, this more southern tip you get to India, the darker the skin color becomes. So humans started out with really dark skin color. As we migrated and started leaving Central Africa, we started moving to environments that got a lot less sunlight. Now you think, well, dark skin's really good at absorbing sunlight, which is true. But the dark skin color also does something very important. Dark skin color blocks UV radiation. UV radiation is that stuff that gives you sunburns, right? Some of us really hate that. But what's really interesting about that is we also kind of need UV radiation a little bit. UV radiation helps us synthesize specific vitamins under our skin that we can't really synthesize very well, and it makes it more useful for us to use, and it makes us healthier. When you're in Africa, you don't need to have too much UV radiation because you get more intense sunlight here at the equator than you get anywhere else on the planet. So in this whole zone here, we're getting some intense solar radiation. You don't need to have too much UV radiation. But when you move away from that, you're getting weaker sunlight at these higher latitudes. And so what we see with this skin color is it was less advantageous to have dark skin color that helped block a lot of that UV radiation that too intensely leads to cancer. And as we move up the planet, we see people's skin color getting lighter and lighter and lighter until you get to the whitest people on the planet, which come from these regions here, the Ireland, the UK, and these Northern Isles. Are not those are the Northern Isles, but these Nordic countries here, where we get some of the whitest people on the planet. They need to absorb more UV radiation. So lighter skin color allowed for deeper penetration of that UV light, making them more successful. Now again, people didn't get white. You didn't take a black African, have him walk out of Africa and be like, "Whoa, now I'm white. Look at this magic." It's more like the lighter variation. There was variation in the species. Those who were lighter were more successful. They were healthier. And over time, they had babies with more people that were lighter because darker people died sooner. As you move up higher and higher, these people here for long, long periods of time, generation after generation, probably thousands of generations or more. And then skin color started being very important and very useful. Now, if you take those same genes and you bring them back down to the equator, a white person's going to burn. They're going to get cancer. They're not going to be as successful. But somebody with darker skin color will be more successful in this area. And again, people don't adapt. Organisms don't adapt. They already have something in their genes that makes them more successful in their environment, and then they pass on those genes, and in their offspring, there is variation. So let's say if I was a dark person, I have 5 children. One of my children is lighter skinned, one of my children is darker skinned. And there's a range of children. My lighter skin may be more successful in these higher latitudes. So they go off and they start making babies with others, and they have variation in their offspring as well. And so you get this slow change in species over time based on these slight differences, these variations in the gene set. So a few things to understand about mutations. Mutations are not necessarily beneficial. Depending on environmental changes, mutations can be fast or slow to make changes in a population. Mutations have to occur in the sex cells to pass the genes on. So let's say I have some kind of mutation that changes my eye color when I am an adult. If that mutation doesn't change in also my eggs that I have, or sperm if I'm a man, then that's not going to be passed on to my offspring. Here in the last one here, populations, not individuals, evolve by becoming genetically different. Mutations have to be common in a population for change to occur as a species. Alright, that's all the time we have. I don't think you actually even had that time to write those notes down. We'll talk about some examples of speciation that we can see here today, that not only do we don't have to just look at the fossil record and see different speciation, but we can watch speciation happen. We can kind of change the environment and see how it alters and change, and we'll talk about that next time.